The graph follows a very strange pattern of seemingly one elasticity and then halfway through switches to another elasticity. I'm going to clean this graph up a little bit. Okay, so what we're seeing here is that at the upper levels of price, this demand curve is following what looks like a very elastic demand curve. And then below a certain price, which we will label as P1, the demand curve changes its elasticity and becomes more inelastic, as I've just followed in red. So if we just are labeling the elasticities of demand for the curve, what we can say is that above P1, which we're going to call this point the kinked point, because a kink is where it starts to bend, above the price of P1, this portion of the curve is elastic. So the price elasticity of demand is elastic. Below the price elasticity of demand is inelastic. Okay, so we can label these portions of the demand curve as elastic and inelastic, but why that becomes important for the oligopolist is when we think about the relationship between price elasticity of demand and total revenue. So what we see is that if the price elasticity of demand above the kink is elastic, then that's going to mean as the price is increasing, total revenue will decrease. Whereas below the kink, if the price elasticity of demand is inelastic, then as price is increasing, total revenue is increasing. So this becomes important because it determines how the oligopoly firms compete. So let's look at this a little bit more. Let's say the firm is producing at price P1, and they're thinking about increasing price. But because they're an oligopoly, or they're working in an oligopoly market structure, they have to think what is their competition going to do? So if they increase price, will the other big firms in the market also increase price? And so what happens is that if the firm increases the price, what happens is that other firms tend not to follow the price increase. So that means that if the firm increases the price, other firms don't increase their price, and therefore the consumer who is buying from firm A can switch to firm B. So that means that you have two things that are happening in terms of price increases. And these two things are the income effect and the substitute effect. These are things that we looked at last year when we talked about the law of demand and what creates the law of demand. So if a price is increasing, as we talked about here, the price going up, then the income effect applies because people only have a certain amount of income, and if the price of a product goes up on a market level, some less people are going to be able to buy the product. But the other thing that applies here is the substitute effect, because if one firm is increasing their price and other firms are not increasing their price, then that means that people will substitute and move to a different firm. So this part of the curve is elastic because people switch to other firms, so the substitute effect is in place, and the income effect is also in place because as prices go up, it takes a larger portion of people's income. Now we're going to consider what happens if the firm is operating at P1 and they decide that they want to lower their price. So what we see here is that the income effect still applies because we're going to see a reaction that as the price gets lower, quantity demand is going to increase. But it's going to increase by a smaller amount than it would have using the upper part of the demand curve because we're now in the inelastic part of the curve. Now, below P1, we have something different happening with the substitute effect because if you remember, we said if the firm increased price, the other firms in the oligopoly do not follow the price increase. But what we have is below P1, if the firm cuts price, other firms will also cut price. So that means that the substitute effect does not apply, because firms won't switch to the substitute because the substitute is also making the price cut. So what happens for the oligopoly market is that it starts to have a very stable price. And that's the big takeaway from the whole idea of the kinked demand curve, is that where that change happens from an elastic demand curve to an inelastic demand curve, what's known as the kink in the demand curve, becomes the very stable price that tends to exist for the oligopoly market structure. So a big idea that you want to make sure you write down here is that prices tend to be stable for firms in an oligopoly. And then what happens is, because of this, what you get is what's called non-price competition, which means that firms compete in ways besides price because of the nature of the demand curve facing the oligopolists, and because they cannot compete well just based on price. They start to do other things to compete, which take the form of non-price competition. And we will go on to look at what are some of the ways that they compete in ways besides price. So in the second lecture on the kinked demand curve, which is on the PowerPoint slides, we'll go through the list of non-price competition. But before we switch to that, we want to add into the kinked demand curve the cost curves facing the oligopolists, and we're going to go over how do you show that on a graph, and how do you figure out where they're producing. Okay, so we start drawing this graph the same way that we've started drawing all of the other graphs, which is with an average total cost curve. And then the marginal cost curve intersects the low point of the average total cost curve, as we have before. So far everything looks like what we've been pretty used to doing. But now what we're going to do is that we have to draw in this demand curve, but now with the kinked demand curve, and then we also have to add in marginal revenue. These curves can be difficult to draw, so there's something that you definitely need to practice drawing. So we're going to start with the demand curve. I'll add the point there of the kink in the demand curve. That's our demand curve. And then I'm going to draw in the marginal revenue curve, which lies below the demand curve. Remember, we saw that when we were doing the cost curves for the monopoly. The marginal revenue curve is following one elasticity, and then when the elasticity shifts at the kink, there's actually a break in the marginal revenue curve, and the marginal revenue curve starts again later down here. So what's in purple, they're both the marginal revenue curve, but there's this area that is known as the jump in the marginal revenue curve. Now, what we're going to see when we are figuring out where does the firm make its profit maximization, we still use the same approach that we've seen before, that where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, that's going to be the point of profit maximization. So here's where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, because even though there's this jump in the marginal revenue curve, this gap takes place all at the same quantity. So even if the marginal cost curve intersects the marginal revenue curve, within that gap, it's going to produce at the same quantity. So the oligopolist is going to achieve profit maximization at Q1. Then the other things that we want to add in is, okay, if that's the quantity, we see then what price do they charge. We do the same exact thing. They go up to the demand curve, and we're going to then see that they're going to charge price 1, but over here is telling us the price that is their marginal cost, and here to the ATC is their price that is at the ATC. So for this firm, what we're showing right now is that, I'm I'm going to show the profit, per unit profit, is going to go from the ATC up to the price. And so that right here, we're showing the profit. Per unit profit would be the difference between price and the ATC, and then the box shows is the profit box. If we wanted to show the revenue box, it would be this whole thing here, which is price times quantity. So here's a really interesting thing. If we take out all the profit box and the revenue box, what if their average total cost curve changes or their marginal cost curve changes? So we're going to draw in a new marginal cost curve here. Let's say that there had been a change in the ATC and a change in the marginal cost. And let's say that the ATC went up and also the marginal cost curve went up. You're going to see marginal cost and marginal revenue are still going to intervene at this, or intersect at the same quantity, and then that means that they're still charged at the same price. So because of this strange marginal revenue curve that is created by the different elasticities of demand, what happens is that marginal costs can change, or ATCs can change by quite a bit, and yet the quantity stays the same, and the price, which is set by the demand curve, also stays the same. So that goes back to the previous point that oligopoly firms tend to not compete on price and instead to compete on other things. So we're going to sum up some of the kind of important facts about the MR curve. First of all, the marginal revenue curve is based on the two different elasticities of the demand curve. So the reason why we have the gap for the marginal revenue curve is that really it's almost as if we have two different demand curves. In other words, if we think about drawing the demand curve, we have an elastic demand curve and then we have an inelastic demand curve. And where they meet here creates the kink, because when the demand curve is done for the oligopolis, it's as if this portion does not exist, and it's as if this portion does not exist. And so what we have left is a demand curve, but it's because they're really facing two different demand curves. So if they're facing two different demand curves, then they have to be facing two different marginal revenue curves. Okay, a second point to keep in mind is when you're drawing the marginal revenue curves is the two marginal revenue curves do not overlap or meet. So in other words, you don't want to be drawing marginal revenue curves that look like here's a marginal revenue curve and then here's a marginal revenue curve. You don't have two separate marginal revenue curves. They're not overlapping and they're not meeting, so you don't want to draw them that way. You have to be really precise in the way that you're drawing them. So the last point we will see is that as long as the marginal cost curve is intercepting the gap in the marginal revenue curve, the firm does not change quantity or price. So again, what we mean here is that if the marginal revenue curve is shown like this and the marginal cost curve intersects anywhere in that gap, like we're seeing here, it could be intersecting here, it could be intersecting here. But it doesn't. What it creates then is that the quantity stays fairly constant. And remember, to set the price, they would be going up to the demand curve. So the demand curve would be what would be used to set the price. So the quantity is still set where marginal revenue and marginal cost intervene for profit maximization, and then the demand curve sets the price. So at this point, if you want to go ahead and go on and watch the PowerPoint, which is PowerPoint Part 2, in order to be able to see some of the non-price competition ways that the oligopoly firms compete. And really that's the key point of the kink demand curve, is that because of the different elasticities which create different marginal revenue curves,